We've had, yes, a Western-dominated international development agenda and architecture, but the Western development model has not been singular for the last 80 years. And we've had the Soviet Union, we've had China, we've had many different countries across the world choosing different pathways. I think what we are seeing is, in a sense, to some extent, dominance of a transatlantic view of how the rest of the world might develop, particularly the least developed countries, going back now to the 50s and 60s. And in that sense, yes, there is certainly a moment in which new directions are emerging. But that's, I think, already something we have seen happening for probably the past decade to decade and a half. It certainly is a geopolitical landscape that is in flux. And the domination of one country, one group of countries, has passed the zenith. In that sense, I think we're going through a period of, well, you could say emancipation on the part of some, a recalibration also of what will in fact drive international cooperation. But I think we are particularly challenged by a sense of disorder, the loss of the rule of law. The challenge to multilateralism is not so much the institution, the buildings, the organizations of the UN. It is what they represent, which was to some degree a reference point where stability, international norms, but also accountability could to some extent be invoked. And I think that is probably the broader context that we are now facing. Learning lessons from the past makes you wiser and less likely to commit the same errors. So I think it is just part of, the human way of thinking and learning that we look to the past. And what history provides us, and historians in particular, is to some extent a reflection and inflection point as we look to the future. I certainly am not somebody who says you should drive your car always look in the rearview mirror, because that's not going to tell you what happens next. But certainly there is a lot that history can first of all make us aware of. In that sense, I think first of all it is a way of learning, but secondly it is sometimes also a way of not only listening to the noise of the moment. You see, once you take a historian's perspective, you start a more analytical view. You start assembling facts that may in the heat of the moment seem peripheral, but turn out to be material to what happened next in the past. And I think in that sense it's also a way of sharpening your, let's say, understanding your instincts, but also the way you start looking into the future with a, let's say, at least more informed way of understanding what's happening. So yes, short answer is, I think we would be a lot poorer and a lot less well-informed and in some respects less wise if we did not have a historian's perspective. I think yes, we sometimes look to the last 30 or 40 years today with a very dismissive narrative on development, on international cooperation. I think that's a big mistake. We have lived through some of the most dynamic decades in developmental terms in human history. The fact that we have to some extent also created new problems, new inequities, and we have not resolved old ones should never distract us from the fact that ideas of the 60s, the 70s and 80s did very much influence the thinking about development, whether it's poverty eradication, basic needs, the centrality of rights and human rights also in development, and ultimately also an international order that does not only reward might and power in the way that international relations are shaped. It goes back to your first question when I said yes, there was a certain dominance of a particular development dogma, I would almost call it. And unfortunately, the World Bank and the IMF became purveyors of a particular ideology at the time that was very much rooted in a transatlantic, sort of Anglo-Saxon articulation of, how to deal with developmental opportunities and challenges. And let's remember, there were very real crises, the first major debt crisis, the increasingly visible gap between developed and developing economies. But I think what the tigers, for instance, the Asian tigers demonstrated is that at a time when the World Bank and the IMF had become very much part of this Milton Friedman era, right? An almost neoliberal view that the less state and the more market, the better the development outcomes will be. You saw the exact opposite happening in the Tigers. I mean, it already began earlier, but industrial policy, which, again, interesting enough, is having a kind of rejuvenation at the moment, including out of the very institutions that dismissed it at the time as being a distraction and a waste of resources, I think demonstrated that we will always have to tailor the particular development pathways to national realities. And sometimes they have not only they're not only a function of economic variables. You know, there is a kind of simplistic view that economics as a science, which it isn't, as we well know, almost gives you a formula of what is an optimal way of running an economy. And I take you to an example that to me is very illustrative of that. Sometimes a society's deeper cultural, historical values are as central to shaping a developmental chapter as a particular recipe, so to speak. And just to take you back to Norway at the beginning of the 20th century when large dam building began. My career dealt with issues of large infrastructure and development quite a lot, and through the World Commission on Dams we studied the fact that in Norway a law already passed in the early teens, the 1918, 1917 I think it was, that regulated the construction of dams in such a way that anyone who would build the dam would have to, by law, include a benefit sharing scheme with downstream or upstream communities affected by the construction of the dam, a revenue sharing model. Yeah. Now, Norway was then amongst the poorest economies in Europe, and yet out of a basic ethos designed a development framework legally that took a very different pathway to the way we saw many large dams being built, and sometimes at extreme cost to people and the environment without any revenue sharing for probably the better part of the 20th century. So this is why I would say the Asian tigers emerged alongside. And yes, there was a kind of global market dogma that was playing out internationally. Remember liberalization, World Trade Organization later on. But these countries actually built their success far more rooted in their own understanding of how they would develop. I was in the 80s an undergraduate here, and already then had the opportunity to listen to somebody who, in an interesting sort of way, became very much part of my working life as a development economist initially, and later on in my international work. And that was Amartya Sen. In fact, I had the privilege of attending a few of his lectures here. Oxford at that time, with Francis Stewart and many others, was also engaged in the evolution of what later became a human development concept. And with UNDP, that I then had the privilege of leading from 2017, the Human Development Report by then had become one of the principal reference works of how to look at development through a broader lens, let's put it that way. Even the HDI, the Human Development Index, does not capture all of the complexity that we face today in development, but it certainly was a frontal challenge to precisely that very singular structural adjustment period where essentially per capita income became the singular measurement and GDP growth of development. But I'm equally inspired by people such as Wangari Maathai, who I then had the privilege, when I was appointed to lead UNEP, to work alongside of for years in Nairobi in Kenya. And I consider her as much of an influence, particularly when it comes to how you empower citizens to do something where they feel they have no power to do anything. And the gesture of planting a tree then became not just a gesture, it actually became a form of resistance. It became a challenge to established views of how we look at environment and nature, which goes to the core of my conviction that we are led by ideas, but we're equally inspired by people. And when the two come together, that's when magic happens.